Bravo, ACLU. You're doing a great job helping to support our civil liberties. Never has anyone had this much freedom in New Orleans to beat, stab, or molest their spouse or children. What a victory for civil rights! The New Orleans Parish Attorney's Office is dismissing 90% of the domestic violence cases it files. In fact, according to another article, only 6% of domestic violence cases filed in New Orleans end in a conviction. That means if you beat your wife in New Orleans, you've got a 94% chance that nothing's going to happen to you. Now, is this just another case of a social justice warrior prosecutor not doing their job? Surprisingly, no. I don't think the New Orleans Parish Attorney is necessarily to blame here, even though his office is the one that's dismissing all of these domestic violence cases. To figure out the absurdity of what's going on in New Orleans, you have to go back a couple years to 2017. When the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the New Orleans District Attorney's Office. You see, this is what happens in the United States. There'll be some town or small city that'll face some hard times. Maybe due to globalism, all of the factories and employers move out of town. Maybe it's subject to some sort of natural disaster, like a hurricane. After such a huge financial setback, a lot of times these communities or cities will have problems trying to provide the services that people need. Adequate police services, adequate public defender services, adequate prosecution, adequate prisons. All of these things cost money. And in order to pay for them, the town has to make choices about taxation. And it's risky and complicated because if you raise taxes, you could lose more employers. So it's a struggle. A small town or city in this situation has to play the game very carefully because if things go wrong, they'll get sued by the American Civil Liberties Union. This is, of course, when things go to complete shit. When this happens, now a financially insolvent city, someplace that's struggling to even provide basic services, now has to go through an expensive court proceeding, financed by billionaires like George Soros. So in the United States, we have individual rights. You have rights if you're a victim of a crime, you have rights if you're a prisoner, you have rights if you're a criminal defendant. And when the local government is poor, when they face some sort of financial setback, there's not a whole lot of money available for the government to see to all of these people's rights. So what the ACLU does is swoop in like some sort of vulture, cause the town or city to waste an inordinate amount of money on litigation, which is wasteful and pointless, and get some federal US district judge to act like a sort of semi-dictator over the locality, forcing it to make certain decisions on how it's going to use its taxpayer money that supposedly benefit the liberties of the people favored by the ACLU, which is typically going to be criminals. Of course, as Patrick Deneen says in his book, Why Liberalism Failed, applying liberal measures in order to solve problems caused by liberalism is akin to pouring gasoline on a raging fire. Depriving financial resources from towns and cities that are already struggling to provide basic services to its citizens is not a recipe for success. Getting some federal judge who might not even live in the city or town and has no knowledge of how local government works is also not a recipe for success. And this is exactly what's happened in New Orleans. To answer the question of why are 90% of domestic violence cases being dropped, you have to go back to 2017. Because 2017 was when the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the New Orleans Parish Attorney's Office for misuse of subpoenas. In the United States, prosecutors have subpoena power in order to get witnesses to court or to get documents produced for an already filed criminal case. If a prosecutor files a criminal case, then what the prosecution will likely do before it goes to trial is it'll send subpoenas to all of its witnesses. Even its own law enforcement witnesses will receive subpoenas. The prosecutor's office can also use subpoenas to gain documents and other things that it needs to present at the trial. However, the prosecutor can only subpoena documents after it's filed a criminal case, generally. Now, I mean, each state is a little bit different. Obviously, don't use this as some sort of legal advice. Consult with a lawyer who's licensed in your state. But that's generally how it works. What the prosecutors can't do is they can't subpoena people for reasons other than getting them to court or getting documents to court. Now, part of the basis for the ACLU's lawsuit was that the New Orleans Parish Attorney was exceeding its subpoena power. In some instances, the Parish Attorney's Office had sent subpoenas to people telling them not to show up at court, but to show up at the Parish Attorney's Office itself in order to be interviewed by prosecutors there. While I agree that the New Orleans Parish Attorney's Office shouldn't have issued these types of subpoenas, I agree that it went beyond what their subpoena power was. The results of the ACLU lawsuit have gone far beyond that, to the point where the New Orleans Parish Attorney's Office is now prohibited from sending subpoenas to crime victims. Well, you might be wondering, what does all of this stuff with subpoenas have to do with domestic violence cases? Well, anyone who's familiar at all with domestic violence knows that the victim of this type of crime, the person who is the subject of the violence, always goes back to the person who abuses them. So a man beats his wife or a wife beats her husband, it goes both ways. They're going to forgive that person again and again and again. One minute someone's beating their wife, the next minute they're apologizing, they're promising to change, the wife forgives them, then they do it again, the process repeats and repeats. Usually it doesn't stop until someone gets killed or the person goes to jail. That's just the reality of domestic violence. This has been a major problem that law enforcement has always faced. They get a call from 911 saying that someone's been abused. They show up and then the victim doesn't want to press charges. It's incredibly wasteful of police resources. It's incredibly wasteful of prosecution resources. So how law enforcement and prosecutors have tackled this sort of problem is that they'll charge the person regardless. If the victim doesn't want to cooperate, if they want to change their story of what happened, then the prosecutor will send them a subpoena requiring them to show up at the trial. If they testify to something inconsistent with what they told police, then the police will testify as to what they originally said. This is how domestic violence cases are prosecuted in the United States. If the prosecutors are unable to subpoena victims, then yeah, almost all domestic violence cases will have to be dismissed by the prosecutor's office. And that's exactly what's happening in New Orleans. In the United States, the ability to subpoena witnesses is absolutely essential to prosecutors' offices. They couldn't do their job without this ability. Domestic violence cases are one example, but subpoenas are also necessary to get witnesses to testify in gang-related cases or organized crime cases. No one's going to voluntarily testify against their spouse or some sort of mob boss or an MS-13 gang member who might try and kill them later. But now, thanks to the ACLU, the New Orleans police will spend millions of dollars of taxpayer money arresting people for domestic violence offenses only to have 90% of those cases dismissed by the prosecutor's office. Bravo, ACLU. You're doing a great job helping to support our civil liberties. Never has anyone had this much freedom in New Orleans to beat, stab, or molest their spouse or children. What a victory for civil rights!